This documentary is the story of Ioannis A. Lougaris and the birth of the Veterans Hospital in Reno, Nevada, which proves that an ordinary individual can accomplish extraordinary things. This is an example that it is not the size of the man, but the size of the heart in the man that matters. My name is Betty Lougaris, and I'm the daughter of Ioannis A. Lougaris, also known as John or Johnny Lougaris, and the history goes way back.
I can tell you exactly, if it wasn't for Mr. Lougaris, there would be no Veterans Hospital in Reno.
I didn't get to be around Mr. Lougaris very much. As a matter of fact, I never called him John because I was a young buck then. I called him Mr. Lougaris. But I had gone up to his office and seen him several times. And I remember the first time I went up there, he was running around in his stocking feet. And I said, Mr. Lougaris, you know you don't have your shoes on. He said, yeah, Harry. He says, I don't wear my shoes in the office. As soon as I get in here, I take them off because it bothers my feet. And I never forgot that.
John was not only a tenant of my father's in the Claudianus building, but it turns out that we ended up being neighbors, a stone throw away. And so we had a nice microcosm of Greeks, and we were alone. We were the only Greek people up here.
The fondest memory I have of my father is sitting with him in the backyard in Reno and looking up at the night sky and seeing all these incredible stars. And he would philosophize. He would talk to me about what was out there and what was life about, and he would often quote old Greek philosophers. And I didn't realize at the time, but I was sitting next to an old Greek philosopher.
When I was growing up, Sparks, Nevada was 15,000. There were 8 Greek families. The kings of the Greek community were governed by Lougaris, who was an attorney, and Claudianus and Demosthenes. And when I think of them today, they were the rulers.
When I was a high school student, my father said to me, you know, I think it'd be a good idea if you had a job and you did something. And so I said, well, what can I do? And he said, well, you can become the janitor down at the Claudianus building. And Mr. Lougaris had the corner office. He was a cigar smoker, and one of my duties was to dump those spittoons and put clean water in them, because most men smoked cigars in those days, so the whole building kind of reeked of tobacco.
And I wouldn't have done what I've done not for John. He's a great old soldier. I loved him.
He was a very generous person, very kind, but also a realistic man too. And he felt that the purpose of other human beings on earth would be to help one another and leave something behind that people will fondly remember, that it did them good and not harm. And that's why I think he was so very dedicated to the hospital.
Hi, I'm John Lougaris.
And I am Joanne Lougaris.
We are the great niece and nephew of Ioannis Lougaris. He was our great uncle that we loved very much and respected very much as well for all of his great accomplishments throughout his life. We also have many memories that we'd like to share a few with you right now. Joanne?
Yeah, I remember him coming to San Francisco and visiting us when we were children. And he always came down with a smile on his face, always happy to see us, remember?
I remember.
And he would always come pull us over and say, come on kids, I want to talk to you. And he would, give us money, and we were always told, well, put it away for college, save that money for college.
I remember those times, I absolutely do. But we really enjoyed it. We were, as I said before, we've been very blessed to have been in his life and to have known him and all of his accomplishments throughout his life. And he taught us many great lessons about who who you should be in this world, and I think of him often today. I'm sure you do too.
Well, one thing I really would, thank him for moving my family to the United States from Zakynthos, which is the island we were born on, except for John, he was born here in the United States. And he sponsored us as earthquake refugees, and it was, with that we moved away from a land of poverty to the United States where we were able to prosper.
Not only on getting the hospital built after the First World War, but until he died. I think the last time he went to Washington, he was 96 and campaigned to get more funds to keep that hospital growing.
He made 10 different trips back to see Senator McCarran that I know of.
The meaning of the Veterans Hospital was that they knew that when their government made a promise to them as soldiers, that promise would be kept and they would be cared for. And they are cared for in that hospital.
He doesn't get anything out of it. There was no reward for doing it. The reward was just to give it. It wasn't about earning money or gaining status. It was about giving without anything expected in return. And I always thought that went back to a bit of his personal philosophy of life.
My father was born on a Greek island called Zakynthos. In English, it's Zante, the island of Zante. They were farmers that raised grapes. And when the grape root was imported to California, from being a prosperous island, Zakynthos turned into a poor island. It was eking out a living. He went as high as the second year of high school, and after that he had to leave school to help his father harvest. But he asked his father to please send him to America. He was corresponding with the Greek in New York and also reading accounts in newspapers about the United States, about America. Gold was in the streets and it was a land of opportunity, and he knew that in Zante he would just live a miserable life. He convinced his father to mortgage the 5.5-acre farm, mortgage the burro that they had, and a goat. And he also was able to get enough money not only for passage to the U.S., but to give him $100 to have spending money when he got there so he wouldn't walk out of the ship with empty pockets. It was a 32-day journey in steerage with very little to eat, horrible conditions. When he got to Ellis Island, he thought he had arrived in paradise. When he stepped off the ship, he kissed the ground. When he saw the flag, he said that America would be the country he would fight for and die for.
It's fascinating when you consider that this man was born in 1887, came to this country in 1907, and he was a poor immigrant. He really had nothing.
He became a citizen in 1915, and in 1917, he enlisted in the Army. At the time when the Kaiser was moving and taking different parts of Europe, my dad felt very patriotic. He felt America was good to him, and he felt that it was his duty. As much training as they gave him before he went to France, not only did he face trench warfare, but hand-to-hand combat, and they were gassing people with mustard gas. Because he was able to swim, they gave him messages that he would carry in his mouth, and he would swim a river and deliver the message to another post. One particular day, it was just probably the worst day. He was gassed. He may have stood up, but he was shot in the lung. After my father was wounded, they picked him up and took him to a hospital, and from there he was sent to an Army hospital in America. He felt that he was spared by God because of some reason that he didn't at the time understand. When my father was discharged from the hospital, he was given $800, almost a death sentence, told he had maybe 3 months to live, possibly more, possibly less. So he decided he would take that money, buy a ticket, and go to San Francisco. On the way there, the train stopped. It was a long trip by train. And he got off, he was standing on the platform, and he met a tall, which he described as a 6-foot-tall, handsome cowboy with a big cowboy hat and boots, and asked what place it was, and the cowboy said, "This is Sparks, Nevada." So my father felt so good. He said the air was so clean, so he asked if there was a bigger city nearby, and the cowboy said, yes, Reno, 3 miles down the road. And the man introduced himself to my dad, and it turned out to be, of all people, Charles B. Henderson, senator from the state of Nevada, so that was a very good first acquaintance. So rather than going to San Francisco, my dad stayed in Reno, and his first job in Reno was given to him by another Greek by the name of Pete Claudianos.
It's surprising even that John and my dad ended up in Reno in those early years, because those who came later came from Zakynthos, didn't share that early time, those years where they came and they were in this little western town, 10 or 12,000 people without anybody to help them. They had to do it on their own.
My dad was quite ill. He was trying to recover, and he did think he had a death sentence. When he stepped off that train in Reno and he started working, somehow hope came to him. He felt hopeful, but there was no hospital, no treatment, and he thought, well, I've got to do something. So 25 miles south of Reno was the capital city of Nevada, Carson. So he decided to go there, and he had met another gentleman who was an Alsatian, and together they went into business and opened a fruit market. At that time, all the people that were politically connected, judges, lawyers, representatives from the different cities, would all come to Carson. So my dad got to know some really interesting people. And if they weren't powerful at the time, they soon would be, because anybody that had anything political to do would come to Carson. The different people that he met in Carson, mostly lawyers and people who were involved in politics, were very inspirational to my dad. One of the things that he decided to do was to enroll in law school. Now, the nearest law school was at Stanford. He had an appointment to go before a board, and there were 3 men on the board, and they would, as my dad put it, examine his brains. So they gave him various tests and called him back, and they said, Mr. Lugaris, we regret to inform you, you will not be accepted into Stanford University. First of all, you don't have enough education. Secondly, your language skills are highly lacking. And thirdly, after testing you, we find you don't have the intelligence of a 12-year-old child. Knowing he would not be able to go to Stanford, my dad decided he would take a correspondence course. He saw a little ad, so he sent $225 that was left of his separation money and started studying at the back of the store. That's where he slept and where he studied. And eventually he did pass the Nevada bar and the California bar, and several years later even Washington, D.C. to practice international law.
Athena Topol, my mother, came to Reno from Chicago in the mid-1930s, with me, only 10 months old, to file for divorce from her first husband. John Lugaris was her attorney. In the mid-1940s, Athena and John were married in the Greek Orthodox Church in San Francisco. That same year, I was adopted and officially became Betty Ioana Lugaris. My mother was the epitome of a Greek beauty, not only physically, but in her kind and gentle spirit. She was quietly in the background, dedicated to our tightly knit family of grandparents, granduncles, and an aunt. Mom was a strong supporter of my father's all-encompassing career as an attorney and his dedication to constantly improve the Veterans Hospital. Although my mother was active in the Reno community, especially in veterans organizations, her first priority was family.
In Reno at that time, there was not a veterans hospital. There was a county hospital, and most of the vets didn't have the money to pay for treatment, and the treatment was horrible. Now, in order to get treatment, they had to drive over the mountains and go down into Sacramento Valley and on to San Francisco. Now, on that journey, quite a few vets would die before they could get to the VA hospital in San Francisco. Consequently, it affected the veterans population. At that time, the American Legion was formed, and also the Veterans of Foreign Wars. My dad, being active and knowing other vets in the area, joined and became very politically active in the organization. He felt that the government really needed to build a hospital in Reno. There were people that were veterans of the First World War, Colonel Thomas W. Miller, for example, Doc John Marty, Howard Farrell, Specs McKenzie, John Triandopoulos. These are veterans that also worked hard to get this hospital built. The VA in Washington did not want to build a hospital in Reno. In order to get this hospital built, they had to bring to the attention of the various lawmakers in Washington, not just Nevada senators. They had to talk to everybody. After cornering people and talking to them and meeting with presidents and the VA, the head of the VA, my dad was making some inroad by being known. One of the quotes that some senator happened to say was, someone said, his secretary said, you know, Mr. Lugaris is here again. And he said, not that old Greek again. So he never gave up. Through the early years, he made many trips back to Washington. There were other veterans involved in this, but he seemed to spearhead this whole program, and the thing was to campaign and get Washington to approve a hospital. The strong, powerful senators in Nevada were Pittman and Senator Pat McCarran. Pat McCarran was a very influential senator. They had to have a meeting between Senator Pittman and Senator McCarran. However, they did not get along that well, one being a Democrat, the other a Republican. It wasn't that they were enemies, that they just didn't agree on some policies. So my father, in order to get them to agree so they could introduce a bill, had to wait for Senator McCarran to be out of the country, and he had to be represented by his executive assistant, Eva Adams, who was a brilliant, brilliant woman, and probably very responsible for McCarran being such a successful senator. So they met, and this is when they agreed that they would then introduce a bill providing that the government will build a hospital in Reno for the veterans. And they had to overcome a lot of difficulty on this because the VA administration in Washington did not feel it was worth putting the money out to build a hospital. And when my father spoke, he said, look, every state in the Union has a VA hospital but Nevada. Why are you denying us the opportunity for health care? So with that in mind, the bill was then introduced and it was passed. So the bill was finally passed, and the date set for the groundbreaking of the hospital was December the 17th, 1937. The day before the groundbreaking was to take place, Attorney General of the state of Nevada, Gray Mashburn, decided that he would place an injunction against the hospital. He felt he should have been consulted, and for some reason, they forgot to consult him. Of course, pandemonium broke out. All over the country, people were very angry and upset. With this injunction, Washington was going to kill the whole project. Of course, my dad was very upset over this particular turn of events. He was angry, he had to do something, so he turned to the veterans for help. He asked all the veterans to please let Mr. Mashburn know how they felt that they would be denied their hospital. The veterans threatened to march on Mr. Mashburn's office in Carson City. Mr. Mashburn called my father and asked him to please tell the veterans that he would call off, he would stop the injunction, and they would get their hospital. The hospital eventually broke ground on December 17, 1937. The hospital was built by McKee Company for $1,650,000. It was a 28-bed hospital, equipped with nurses and doctors. The hospital opened its doors for patients May 22, 1939. And even though they didn't have cable TV, it was still a very comfortable hospital. Patients came to the hospital from all parts of northern Nevada, from California, Northern California, Oregon, and Idaho. The hospital was a big change in the community because not only were veterans being treated, but there were jobs offered. I mean, they needed nurses and doctors and x-ray people and pharmacists. So it was economically a very good thing, and it was emotionally and culturally very good for the veterans. My father, walking through the halls of the hospital, felt very great pride. He had many times had to be a patient himself because he never truly recovered from his war wounds, but he didn't stop. Even though the hospital was built, my father kept working towards getting more facilities, more equipment, more doctors, more nurses, and after the Second World War, the need for the hospital to expand was very great. My dad made more trips to Washington. They became stronger in their effort, and they had to get a second unit built, and a second unit was built. In the late 30s and early 40s, we all knew each other. However, a lot of new people came to town because of the war.
Times were rough for African American soldiers coming back from the war, and especially in rural Nevada. Alice and Al O. Smith met John Lugaris after Al had been denied admission to the Veterans Hospital in Reno. He tried on 2 occasions. For Alice, being the kind of woman that she was tremendously shocked, hurt, disappointed in a government that sent her husband overseas to fight for liberty, and having come back, could not make use of those same liberties that he'd fought so valiantly for.
They left the hospital and were on the steps leading up to the main door, and a gentleman saw Mrs. Smith holding her husband, and he was obviously in pain. And he asked them what was wrong, and she said, "They won't let us come in because there are no segregated wards." So the man said, "Well," he said, "you've got to see John Lugaris. He's the guy that really helped get this hospital built."
After Alfred and Alice talked with John Lugaris, they were able to get Al admitted to the hospital. Unfortunately, it was too late because he died soon after he was admitted.
My dad was so outraged by the way that Mr. Smith was treated that he did sue the hospital. And at the same time, it was like a kickoff for the civil rights in Reno. Today, the hospital has grown immensely. There was another wing added in 1946, and then more additions later, and then finally, just 10 years ago, they built the tower and another addition. So the hospital has now grown to quite a different facility. And yet in the picture you can see the little original 27-bed hospital. And behind it is the huge second addition, and then the third addition and a 6-story tower.
In our entire service area, which expands into Eastern California and up to the Oregon border and quite a bit east and south as well, we estimate there's about 120,000 veterans in that whole area. About 30,000 roughly of those veterans are getting care here or in the VA Sierra Nevada healthcare system, of which the Ioannidis A. Lugares VA Medical Center is the hub. So that's quite a few patients, 30,000.
Medical care has really changed a lot since this hospital was built in 1939. We're doing a lot of things like, for example, the patient-aligned care teams, where the patient becomes the center of their care team. They're involved just like the doctor, or the pharmacist, or the mental health professional, the nurse. It's a collaborative effort. So there's a lot more of a cultural transformation that's going along, as opposed to just treating and treating people anymore. We're taking in a whole approach on holistic care as well.
If my father were alive today and could see what has happened with the hospital, he would be so truly amazed and happy, because some of the money that was appropriated when he was 96 years old and went back and once again spoke to the VA administration and other senators and congressmen, that happened before he passed away, and that money is still coming in and allowing the hospital to constantly grow.
I remember Mr. Lugares passing away in 1987. I went to his funeral. He lived to be 100 years old, which was really amazing due to the fact that he'd been gassed during the war and he'd been shot. And here's a man who went through all that and lived to be 100. So that was quite an amazing feat for him. He was an unusual individual.
Not only do you see construction going on, but the new things that have been added, for example, to accommodate the women who are now coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. They have an OBGYN ward. They have training on computers. They have a conference room that hooks into other VA hospitals all over the country. The progress is amazing.
I'm real pleased with the assistants and the way they take care of me and the way I see them take care of everybody else. Hospital is #1 as far as I'm concerned.
My father and the other veterans that helped him, members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, members of the American Legion, members of the Disabled American Veterans, their entire purpose was to keep that hospital growing in order to provide services for other vets. We've had so many conflicts, so many wars that we've been involved in, and the veterans definitely deserve the best of care. And the legacy is that today the hospital serves 250,000 vets a year.
Well, all I can say is I'm thankful that the powers to be put a man in Reno like John Lugares, who was instrumental in getting the hospital assigned to Reno for our use.
Betty Lugaris, producer, writer, and director of this historical documentary, When the War Ends, the Fight Begins. Credit, acknowledgement, and thanks go to executive producer of this documentary, Mr. Evangelos M. Stasinopoulos, who so generously financed this project and also contributed funds for the needs of the veterans being treated at the Ioannis A. Lugaris VA Hospital in Reno. Acknowledgement and thanks go to coordinating producer Ms. Eleni Stasinopoulos Molokotos, who was the financial liaison between Mr. Stasinopoulos and myself, enabling me to document this event. I also give thanks to my sons, John Dennis Soldo and Mark Philip Soldo, for their encouragement and support during the production of this part of American history. This hospital serves the veterans of Northern Nevada, parts of California, and Oregon, and continues to grow to this day and hopefully beyond.